Destiny of a Savior by Famous Fault. Chapter 9, The Funeral. Time passed faster when one had something to talk about. That's why the flight from Domino Airport to London seemed rather short. Despite the fact that Yugi always had felt sorry for Rio because of the things he had went through, he was silently glad it had happened now. He would not have been sure if Rio would have believed him otherwise. Rio, however, did believe him, without a second of hesitation. Yugi spent the entire flight telling Rio whatever he could about the Wizarding World. Among other things, he let him look through the collection of daily prophets, which Yugi had gathered, and with the help from those explained everything about the current situation of the Wizarding World and how he had ended up there. Rio had listened with an expression varying between horrified and fascinated. Yugi didn't hide anything. He filled Rio in on the PTSD, Rebecca, Lucius Malfoy, Umbridge, the Shadow Creatures, the Dominion of the Beasts, what happened in the Ministry, truly everything. This Dumbledore was a friend of yours? Rio asked, sounding appropriately sorry. Is that why you want to attend his funeral? Actually, Dumbledore didn't trust us, Yugi said darkly. He was very wary of me, and not without reason. There was, however, one thing we had in common. We both wanted the students' best. With Dumbledore gone, the school isn't any more safe than any other place in the Wizarding World. Tim once said he wouldn't just stand by as the students are slaughtered, and I agree with him. I'm going to Dumbledore's funeral since I respect him, and to measure the condition of the war. It's still hard to think of you as a teacher. Truth be told, it's easier to imagine a Tim as Pharaoh than you as teacher, he said, and smiled his characteristic smile and put a hand on the back of his head. So I've been told, Yugi muttered. Then again, it's not hard to picture a Tim as a Pharaoh at all. Hey, Rio, if you don't want to get involved in this, then just say so. People have died in this war already, and more will. Actually, I think the war is just starting now. Rio smiled as a beard. No, I won't claim that I did not enjoy a simpler life for a while. I would love a simpler life. But we lost that privilege with our items, didn't we? I mean, even though it's kind of done, it's still not something I can move on from. Then Rio's tone hardened to a tone Yugi rarely heard him use. And besides, if our friends died due to those Death Eaters, I will gladly participate in a war against them. But can you take it? Yugi asked the albino next to him. Had someone asked Yugi that 6 years ago, he wouldn't have doubted the answer. No, he couldn't have. 4 years in the shadows had, however, taught him to harden up to stand the sight of death and decay. Rio was completely unprepared. I've been possessed by a demon, Rio whispered, and looked out the little square window. I've already seen it. Yugi pressed his lips together tightly. He'd forgotten that Rio's friends, before he moved to Domino, had been imprisoned, and it was only thanks to Atem's insight in games and Rio's persistence that they had awoken. In addition to that, he had already lost a fair amount of relatives in one way or another. Yugi knew for a fact that Rio still wrote to Imani. Lastly, Rio had also been there when Lucius attacked them. Perhaps Rio could manage, maybe even better than Yugi could. Their journey included a lot of talking and little rest, but neither of the two was tired when the plane, after many hours, finally landed in London, where it was far past midnight. They got their luggage, and without further ado, they caught a cab, which brought them as far to central London as it could. At least, Yugi said after he had paid the driver and closed the door behind him, here your accent won't stick out. Rio smiled. At least there will be something that doesn't stand out. Where exactly are we going? Yugi didn't answer, just took the lead as they walked over the streets of London, which, even at the late hour, were still bursting with life. Actually, Yugi preferred larger cities, especially those like London, New York, and Las Vegas, where there were so many different people there that he didn't stand out as much as he could have. Without thinking too much about it, he walked towards the leaky cauldron. Rio, however, stopped at the sight of the broken-down old shop. Yugi, are you sure you're going in there? I forgot you did not know, Yugi said and blushed in shame. Look closer. It's not a boarded-up shop, it's a pub. Come on. Without waiting for Rio to reply or comprehend, Yugi walked in. Like he had expected, it didn't look like it had last time. It was still dark and shabby, but it had been lively the first time he had entered it. Now it was empty, with the exception for the landlord, Tom. Tom looked up in surprise at the two walking in, and Yugi detected a glimmer of fear in his eyes. He had clearly not expected anyone to enter his pub at this time of night, with the exception of those who wanted ill, perhaps. The look in Tom's eyes, however, quickly changed to recognition when Yugi stepped forward, taking in the pub with distrust. It really is a pub, Rio whispered so that only Yugi could hear. Yugi nodded a little, only detectable for those who were really looking at him. Yugi's eyes turned back to the barman. The pub really seemed to be empty. He was sincerely hoping that the barman recognized him from 2 years ago, when he had stayed there and not from the Daily Prophet. Luck might have been with Yugi in games, but never in real life.
"You're the possessed teacher,"
the barman said with disgust in his voice, and his eyes fell upon the puzzle around Yugi's neck.
"Prophet sure didn't tell us everything."
Yugi sighed. He would have to learn to live with the fact that he would be recognized wherever he went, and it mostly would be in a negative air. Perhaps when this was all over, he'd look for a third world, a peaceful one, and he'd make sure no one would recognize him the way they did either here or in the Muggle world. He knew it would never happen, but it was a nice thought. "The Prophet doesn't tell us anything," Yugi said, sounding bitter, and walked forward, closely followed by Rio, and sat down on one of the bar stools. Tom recoiled from Yugi visibly, but the foreigner decided not to care too much. It was expected.
"I don't want people like you in my pub,"
he hissed and turned away from him. Yugi put 2 galleons on the counter. "Give us a room," he sighed and caught the man's eye. "We'll be gone tomorrow morning. Aren't you going to attend Dumbledore's funeral?"
"Out, I said!"
Tom yelled angrily, although Yugi noticed that his eyes fell upon the galleons. Business couldn't be all too good at times like these, and it was painfully obvious he needed the money. Rio added a galleon and turned away, knowing very well where the rooms were. "You won't see or hear anything from us anymore. Good night, Tom." Then he walked towards the wooden staircase, gesturing for Rio to follow him. When they reached the corridor, Rio whispered, "Does everyone in the Wizarding World know about the dem?" Yugi nodded with a grim expression. "We should assume so, yes." "And will everyone react like that?" Rio asked with disbelief. "Haven't they ever met him?" "They have a lot of prejudice in this world. I was told you so, didn't I? Here, they don't have to meet someone to create an opinion of them. They heard I was possessed, so they will react like that. They won't give me a chance. Not you either, since you're with me." Yugi looked at his pale friend with a small smile. Then he opened the door to a seemingly random room. But Yugi had quite consciously refrained from choosing the same room as he had last time. "So everyone hates you without having met you? Either of you?" Rio asked, and without waiting for an answer, he added, "That must really suck." Yugi rose an eyebrow. Rio hardly said things in such a manner. The room Yugi had entered contained 2 single beds, a lit fire, and polished oak furniture. It was not too large, but it would do just fine for their purposes. Rio unceremoniously tossed his luggage on one of the beds and sat down on it. "What time is it?" Rio asked curiously as he looked out the window, only to be met with his own ghostly reflection. "About 2 in the morning," Yugi said, and in his turn tossed his luggage on a bed. "How so?" "It's 10 in the morning back home. No wonder I'm not tired. When's the funeral, anyway?" "Tomorrow after breakfast, so you better get some sleep anyway. We'll have to hit the road as soon as we wake up to get there in time," he warned his companion, and unceremoniously grabbed a towel. "I'll be back in 10 minutes. When's the funeral, anyway?" "Tomorrow after breakfast, so you better get some sleep anyway. We'll have to hit the road as soon as we wake up to get there in time," he warned his companion, and "It's quite different to be in one of these rooms with a friend like Rio than when it was just you and me." The Dem's smile widened, but also hardened. "That could also have to do with the hatred we expelled." "A combination, probably," Yugi sighed and threw his bag off the bed. He hurled himself into a ball before closing his eyes and letting the abyss of sleep get a steady grip over him.
"What do you want?" he asked and opened half an eye. He did not like to be awoken in the dead of night, especially not by someone shining a light into his eyes. He was too tired to realize that he lived alone and that no one should have been able to get into his apartment in the first place.
He received no answer, and the bright white light was hurting his eyes, so he closed it again and pulled the sheets over his head. The light was, however, so strong that it easily penetrated through the fabric and kept bothering his eyes. He was still not awake enough to realize how wrong this all was. "Mokuba," a soft voice said. That made Mokuba wake up. He shut up and opened his eyes wide just to be hurt by the light, and he threw up his arms to shield his face. There wasn't supposed to be someone in his apartment, he realized. He panicked slightly. "Who are you?" he yelled. "Mokuba," the voice repeated, sounding like the nicest person Mokuba had ever encountered. There was something extremely innocent about it, and something incredibly inhuman. He looked up carefully and was met by a sight that he associated with fairy tale and stories.
In a bright white light, a woman his age was levitating, smiling down on him. Her eyes were deep, gentle blue, her long hair was white with a bluish hue, and she was oddly enough dressed in a brown garment that witnessed of poverty. Circling around here was a transparent blue-eyes white dragon. Mokuba dropped his jaw. He had seen a lot of odd things, unexplainable things, but they had never been aimed at him before. He'd mostly been standing at the sidelines while Yugi, Jinochi, and most importantly, his brother were fighting for their lives, and that of everyone else. Freaky apparitions in the dead of night were their thing. "Who are you?" he repeated, though much less aggressive. Mokuba knew very well that his brother had had an unusual connection to the dragon, but he had never understood it. This, however, made little sense too. Perhaps it was connected.
"They will need you, Mokuba," she said, her voice a whisper in his head.
"What's your name?" he inquired, disregarding her words, although he understood very little of them.
"I'll lead the way. You'll be reunited." She smiled softly and held up a hand the dragon Mokuba was so familiar with, buffed against it like a kitten, and the girl petted the white snout, not the least worried about the huge fangs. "With who? Seto?" Mokuba tossed away the sheets and stood up eager for information. He received no answer. The odd pair of dragon and girl vanished slowly as the white light decreased in strength. Eventually, the only proof left of the girl and the dragon were white spots dancing over Mokuba's vision. When they disappeared, he noticed that the 3 blue-eyes white dragon cards were laying on the floor of his bedroom. He picked them up and looked closely at the dragons depicted on them. The color of blue the eyes of the dragons had were the same as the girl had. He put the cards on his dresser and sat down on the bed again. He had never seen anything quite like it, and it was something he'd have to process. Then he stopped in mid-motion. He had seen something like that before. It had not been exactly the same, but it was something of that style. The ritual duel. The dark magician had changed into someone who was more human than monster. It had been a tanned man with brown hair in the dark magician's costume. Perhaps this had been something in that style. The problem was that Mokuba had no idea who or what that man had been either. Except for one thing. The dark magician had called the pharaoh for his king with familiarity, as if they knew each other.
Mokuba sighed. Of course, it was always Yugimoto things pointed to, and if it was not, then at the pharaoh Tem.
But this time, it was also pointing at his brother. Why else would it have been the blue-eyes white dragon who had woken him in the dead of the night?
"Ah!" he yelled, frustrated, and thumped his fists on the bed, doing little damage to either his fists or the bed. So many questions were going through his head that he could not get any of them in any sort of order. Who was the girl? Where had she come from? What was her relation to Blue Eyes? What was his brother's relation to the Blue Eyes? Was it connected to a Tem? Who was the dark magician man? What was his relation to the pharaoh? Were the girl and the man connected? What had his brother to do with all this? Who needed them? Reunited with who?
But deep under his frustration, confusion, and anger, there was something hopeful. Perhaps he finally would get answers on the questions he had been asking himself for such a long time. Nobody noticed them where they stood. No one had noticed them arriving either. They were standing in the line of the aisle, but removed quite far away from the chairs. So someone had to look behind him or herself consciously in order to notice them. At the moment they arrived, Hagrid had just started to carry Dumbledore's limp body towards something that resembled a large marble table. Everyone's eyes had been focused on Hagrid and Dumbledore. No one had noticed them. They were both cloaked and had the hoods covering their faces. Even if someone would see them, they would not be able to tell who they were. It did, however, not work reversed. Some of the people Yugi did not recognize, but a fair bit he did. With distaste, he noticed Cornelius Fudge, Rita Skeeter, and perhaps worst of all, Dolores Umbridge, sitting among the crowd. Yugi had expected Hagrid to catch sight of them when he walked back down the aisle toward his seat, but he noticed that Hagrid's eyes were so red and swollen that it was a wonder he could see at all. Yugi didn't miss the scandalized look Umbridge threw Hagrid as he sobbed, and hatred poured through him. How dare she show up at Dumbledore's funeral and then reproach Hagrid for showing his sorrow? Hagrid sat down next to something that looked like a, giant. Yugi wasn't even surprised. If there were werewolves and centaurs, then there could be giants as well.
He was used to this by now. He just wished he could see Rio's expression. The Black Hoods, however, easily hid their expressions.
A tufty-haired man in plain black robes stood up and walked towards the white marble table, which Rio and Yugi had a clear view over, as there was no one in the aisle to block it. The man stared at his speech, and the words he said and the tone he used made one thing clear to Yugi. This short man had never met Dumbledore in person. It was cruel that Dumbledore was refused a proper burial simply because the Ministry had to keep its appearance up. Had Dumbledore had a regular funeral, the Umbridge would never have been there, not Alexander Bagnod either, and the same thing would have counted for all the other Ministry officials who were sitting there with false expressions of grief. Yugi was disgusted.
I understand, partner.
Atem said and appeared next to Yugi to put a hand on the shorter's shoulder.
But I think they fulfilled his prime wish. What would that be?
Yugi asked, his tone unable to hide the negative emotions.
He's laid to rest at Hogwarts. I believe that would be what he wanted.
Yugi smiled. Atem nearly always had the right words, and today was no exception. The simple thought made Yugi discard the ugly features of the funeral and focus on the good ones. As he looked around closely, he noticed that the centaurs were there too, and to his surprise, something that looked like merpeople. Nearly every student of Hogwarts had to be present, and Yugi caught sight of Dobby, who was crying big round tears. There were people here that truly cared, including himself. Then several people screamed. Bright white flames had erupted around Dumbledore's body and the table upon which it lay. Higher and higher they rose, obscuring the body. White smoke spiraled into the air and made strange shapes. Then the fire vanished, and in its place was a white marble tomb, encasing Dumbledore's body and the table on which he had rested. The centaurs did not waste any time. They paid their tribute to Dumbledore by firing their bows. More people screamed, but they had not needed to worry. The arrows didn't even land close to the people seated in the golden chairs. Then Atem caught Yugi's attention and pointed at the trees of the Forbidden Forest. In there was a bird, and at first sight everyone would have expected it to be Fox. At closer look, it was quite clear that it wasn't Fox at all. It was a monster called Firebird. Dumbledore's Ka, Yugi realized as the bird took flight and did not stop rising until it could not be seen. Off to the dominion of the beasts, Yugi thought with a smile, just like it was supposed to be. He just hoped no one else had noticed. Nobody else got up to speak. The centaurs and the merpeople left, and people started talking among themselves with low voices. Apparently the funeral had already ended. In Yugi's opinion, it had been remarkably short in comparison to those of Rebecca and Professor Hawkins, but then again he had not arrived at the beginning.
That was... Rio paused to find the right word. Tense.
Was it? Yugi asked and looked at his pale friend.
Yes, you did not notice. There is a lot of hostility in the air. Was this all just a theater?
Rio's brown eyes showed that it was a genuine question. It wasn't even mocking. They also showed understandable surprise.
Yes, some people here did most definitely not grieve, and others here knew that.
Yugi pointed discreetly at Umbridge, who was standing far away from the forest, talking to a colleague who acted just as overbearing.
That's Umbridge. I told you about her.
Yugi scowled at the sadistic woman, but Yugi just went on, pointing out several individuals who were all acting to be grieved by Dumbledore's passing. Then he pointed out other people, Tracy and Dean, Harry, Peter, Madame Hooch, Dobby, and several other people who Yugi believed Rio should know about. Naturally, there was no chance that Rio would be able to remember all of them on such short notice, but at least he got a vague idea. Several people had noticed them by now, and Yugi knew very well that they looked very suspicious, considering their dressing and distance, but he would not take the first step. At least not unless he needed to. He saw a red-eyed Minerva looking their way from where she stood in the aisle with a worried frown. Professor Flitwick and a shabby man holding the hand of a woman with vivid pink hair joined her. They all had their wands drawn. Yugi supposed that after the Death Eater attack on the school, they were bound to be suspicious of anyone unwilling to let their presence be known. He sighed, dejected.
Come on, Yugi told Rio, before they think we're Death Eaters. Minerva McGonagall is already wary about us.
Rio did not reply, but followed as Yugi walked towards the chairs, his hood still covering his face. The persons who Yugi assumed to be the parents of all the Weasleys joined Minerva quickly, and so did a dark-skinned Auror. Several ministry officials had noticed them too. Slowly but sure, the majority of the eyes present had turned their way.
I hope you're ready to cause some upheaval. Most people will either fear or hate me more than Tom did." He heard a soft chuckle from Rio. "I hope you know what you're doing." Still, about half of the people there were unaware about them, but Yugi was sure that would soon change. He raised his hands, not fast enough to seem threatening, but not too slow either. He pushed down his hood as he reached the aisle with a fluid motion. There was a second of utter silence, which Rio used to pull his hood down. McGonagall did not lower her wand, but she did not aim it at them anymore. The last time he had seen her, he had been dragged out of Dumbledore's office by Umbridge, and McGonagall had furiously told Umbridge to be careful. That was well over a year ago, but clearly McGonagall had not forgotten how the Ministry had treated him. Her face cracked up in a mixture of disbelief, relief, and joy. Then she looked around to see how others reacted. Yugi noticed in a corner of his eyes that Rita's feather was raining furiously, and he hissed so only he could hear. Then something shot him to mind. He had to speak with her. He had an important question to ask her. Umbridge's eyes were nearly bulging out of her sockets. The last time she had seen him, he had lain on the floor, broken, and the puzzle had been shattered in the hands of the Ministry. Apparently, she had not been informed about the fact that the puzzle was back with him, and she looked at it horrified. Professor Flitwick lowered his wand and smiled, satisfied, although trails of tears were still visible. At the reaction of the teacher, the Weasleys lowered their wands too. The shabby man, Yugi suddenly recognized from the Ministry of Magic, did not. He still had it aimed at Rio. "He has his mind full set on warfare," Atem noted, not sounding completely displeased. Yugi noted the words, but did not answer them. He was still observing the reactions of people as he kept approaching the little assembly on the aisle with decent pace. The Ministry officials looked at him with either fear or hatred, like he had expected. Fudge, who wasn't minister anymore, stumbled backwards when he caught sight of the Japanese and overturned the chairs behind him. The general crowd of people who had caught sight of him reacted much like Tom. They seemed shocked at the prospect of a possessed person showing up at the funeral of Dumbledore. Some of them looked a bit scared, but mostly it was disgust that was written over their faces. It was interesting that normal people reacted with disgust and the Ministry officials with fear. He supposed that the Ministry officials knew what had happened in the Ministry of Magic. More or less. The overall welcome was negative, but it was also passive. Nobody raised their wand against him, and no one told him he wasn't welcome. Then a cry was heard from where the students had sat. "Professor Mato!" someone called out, and the tone in their voice was joyous. Yugi glanced towards it and saw Tracy standing next to Dean with a smile on her face. At least someone was truly happy to see him. The both of them. Yugi slowed down as he reached the little assembly of adults which had caught sight of him, and Rio first. Then he stopped, a few meters from the man with the shabby clothes who had taken the front. "Minerva? Phileas?" He greeted them with an indisputable polite tone. Then McGonagall started crying again and pushed her way past the man with the cautious expression. For a moment, Yugi thought McGonagall was going to hug him, but she did not lose her dignity. "I'm glad to see you're all right, Muto. I'm sorry our last encounter was so chaotic," Yugi said, his tone still uncharacteristically polite. McGonagall shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "If they try anything—" Although her entire posture screamed sorrow, her voice was as steady as ever. "They won't. And if they do, we'll be ready for them," Yugi said, making sure the nearest by Ministry officials heard him. "This is a funeral. We're here to pay our respects." Then he lowered his voice so only McGonagall would hear. "Thank you, Minerva." McGonagall frowned. "Thank you for protecting my students." Yugi stiffened at those words. He had protected the students then, and it had not been enough, but he had also abandoned them. McGonagall did not know it, but her words had made an iron gate fall down behind Yugi. He'd have to stay now, do everything he could. He looked at the students who were making their way up to the castle, most of them anyway. He couldn't help but wonder how many would die over the summer. Yugi smiled at her, a small, joyless smile, and walked past her. The shabby man stopped them, however. "Who are you?"
"Remus, you know very well who he is. Everyone here does,"
Professor Flitwick said to Yugi's defense. "I wasn't talking about him." Remus bit back at that unfriendly. Yugi was sure no one had expected Rio's reaction. The albino put on a sincerely surprised and not a little shocked expression. "Me?" he asked, incredulous while unconsciously pointing at himself. He looked from the shabby man to Yugi and back to Remus. Rio's brown eyes couldn't tell a lie, and the rest of the people present noticed that too. Yugi stopped himself from covering his eyes with a single hand and shake his head in disbelief. Instead, he looked at Rio with a disbelieving expression paired with a sad smile. Rio, you're a saint, he said in Japanese. Then he switched back to English. Welcome to a world at war. They'll even trust you. But I'm no threat to them, Yugi whispered. They don't know that, Yugi said warningly, indicating that it should stay that way. Primus, who had heard the entire conversation, raised an eyebrow, but he repeated his questions. Who are you? Rio Bakura, Rio said, and Yugi noticed the little twitch in Rio's arm, witnessing of his urge to hold out a hand. Unbelievable. He's an old friend, Yugi clarified, while avoiding any further questions. Now please, let us pass. Primus still did not look all too happy, but moved to the side to let them pass. Yugi walked by, and Rio quickly followed, not eager to stay with people who treated him that hostile. Since the people from the ministry had been sitting in the first rows, the closer he and Rio ventured to the White Tomb, the more people drew their wands in fear. Yugi sighed, but disregarded them. At least both Fudge and Umbridge seemed to take their refuge as far away from them as possible. Yugi didn't stop until he was only a few feet away from the tomb. He vaguely noticed that Rio hadn't followed him all the way. He looked behind him to see Rio sitting on a chair in the first row. There was no one in a pretty large radius around Rio. No one except a cat. The albino held out a hand towards it, and when the cat buffed against his hand, he petted it. When the cat, which was both dotted and striped, started purring, Rio lifted it and put the feline in his lap. Yugi smiled. No one would ever be as gentle as Rio. Then he turned back to the tomb, putting a hand on it. The surface was pretty smooth, unscathed and white. Yugi let his hand trail over it until he reached the corner of the tomb. Do you think anyone would notice? He asked the former king. Eventually, but not at once. Do you think I have the ability to do something like that? Don't you? Yugi retorted. I'm not sure. It's not what it is usually used for. Perhaps with some aid, though that will be seen. Atem fell silent for a minute, but then nodded mentally. Let me take control, and I'll do it. It should be possible. Yugi didn't ask any more questions. Instead, he retreated to his storeroom, wondering how many people would notice the change. A fair bit, he was sure. Fundamentally, Atem and he were quite different. The spirit left a hand on the corner of the tomb and concentrated on what he wanted to appear there. It would not be big. In fact, he wanted it so small that it could be covered with a regular playing card. Then the Eye of Horus appeared on his forehead, and Blaze-Wing Butterfly appeared. Atem heard gasps coming from behind him, but he ignored them. He removed his hand and gave the flaming overlarge butterfly his instructions. Yugi turned to Rio, who raised an eyebrow at the performance and the glowing eye on the former king's forehead. Then slowly a smirk appeared. Had I known you were able to do that, you could have helped me with carrying in those deliveries. The cat in Rio's lap was purring, satisfied as Rio kept petting it. The nearest Ministry officials gasped again in something close to horror when they saw the glowing symbol on the forehead of the pharaoh they had tried to destroy. Far away he saw Umbridge fleeing the field, and he was a bit sorry she did not faint, though her obvious fear was satisfactory too. The teachers of Hogwarts who caught sight of him where he stood, half turned towards the chairs, while waiting for the creature to finish, gawked. They did not look fearful, just plain baffled. The students' expressions were hard to measure. Neville, Luna, Peter, Tracy, Ginny, and Dean didn't look surprised. They had all seen it before. What caused the surprise on their faces was him being there at all. Atem was pleased to note that they actually looked glad to see him. The expressions of the rest of the students varied between fearful to joyous or simple confusion. Confusion was mostly reserved for the first years who had no idea who he was. Excuse me, he heard someone say, and he saw 2 first years standing as close to Rio as they dared. Atem let go of the shadows as he noticed that the creature was done, and the eye faded just like the butterfly. Instead, Atem settled for watching the exchange between the 2 students and Rio. The shortest one of the 2 was wearing Gryffindor robes and held his head high and doing his best to show as much confidence as possible. Although he did not succeed completely, Atem admired his efforts. Yes? Rio asked with a kind tone, catching the kids off guard. Oddly enough, it was the shyer one of them with the Ravenclaw robes who recovered first, and he took a step forward so he was standing next to his friend. The train leaves soon, and I need Jun back. Rio had no idea what Jun was, but Atem had an idea and smirked. Then he heard Yugi in the back of his mind. "That's Cole Clancy!" The smirk disappeared from Atem's face as soon as it had appeared. The boy was indeed the one which Yugi had given his deck in order to never see it again. It was simply cruel that he ended up at Hogwarts, probably with Yugi's deck. Atem believed in signs. He had been around for too long to not believe in them. Apparently, they'd never be able to rid themselves of their identity as the king of games.
The monster in disguise of a cat!
The Gryffindor clarified, his tone witnessing of a clear dislike. "This little creature?" Rio asked with a laugh. "He's no monster."
She is!
The boy said, and crossed his arms. Rio lifted the cat from his lap and gently put her on the ground. She looked at him a little disappointed since he stopped petting her, but then she lazily walked towards Cole, moving more graceful than any cat had a right to. Cole picked her up with a smile, and she quickly made her way up on his shoulder. Then the shorter one turned to Atem.
I don't know why everyone here is so afraid of you, but I'm glad I just found out why nothing ever seemed quite natural.
Atem raised an eyebrow. "What exactly are you referring to?"
I know this was before my time, but I've seen enough from what happened anyway. It's completely normal that TVs all over Domino exploded when Obelisk and Slaver clashed. You're the king of games,
the boy said and crossed his arms. Atem chuckled, but it was without any joy. "That was a long time ago."
but people won't forget.
The Gryffindor retorted.
You will always be the king of games to anyone who calls themselves a duelist. You can't run away from that.
"You're not Yugi Moto," Cole said out of the blue.
What?
The boy called out and turned to his taller friend. Atem just smiled, waiting for the boy to continue. He would not leave it at that. "You look like him," Cole countered, ignoring the Gryffindor. "But you aren't him. You're different. Your posture is different, and your voice isn't nearly the same. But most importantly, you've got red eyes. You're not the same person as the one I saw in London." "True," Atem said, and his smile grew.
Then who is he?
The Gryffindor asked, looking at Cole. The Ravenclaw shook his head. "I have no idea who he is, but are you the reason everyone is so scared of you?" Atem nodded. "You've been around for a long time. My brother Theo used to say that every person has their normal selves and the duelist inside them. With Yugi, it was simply extremely pronounced. That wasn't the deal, was it? You simply are two different people." "Who are you?" Cole asked. He had said every word slowly, warily, uncertain about the reaction he'd receive. "Who I am does not matter," Atem said. "Don't go digging around in this. You won't find any answers."
You really never have an answer to spare for anyone. Perhaps if you just told people who you are, they would not be so afraid of you.
The Gryffindor said and scowled at him. "It's slightly more complicated than that," Atem said with a raised eyebrow.
Yeah, sure.
He snorted and turned away, looking a bit, distasteful.
You're just running away.
"Boys," Rio said, a bit reproachful, unexpectedly meddling in the conversation. "Some things should simply not surface." Yugi, who had taken control as soon as Rio had distracted the boys, shot the albino a grateful look, which was received and accepted. The Gryffindor snorted again.
You're Rio Bakura. You also participated in Battle City. Let me guess, you also have a different personality or something? Of course, it can't have been very impressive as you lost the first round.
Rio looked shocked and did not know how to reply to that. Instead, he grew even paler as he tended to be, and Yugi saw fear and agony sweep over his features. Yami Bakura hadn't been a part of Rio's life he did not wish to be reminded of. "Enough!" Yugi said sharply, staring into the eyes of the Gryffindor. "Don't talk about these things as if you know what they are. Don't you think there is a reason for why these people are afraid? They have very good reasons to be afraid. Some of them should be mortified. Mohitori no Moku is far more dangerous than you realize. The power he controls is far more dangerous than you realize. Neither he nor I wish harm upon anyone. In fact, we came back here to protect the students against the horror about to strike down now that Dumbledore's gone. But have this very clear. We do that our own way, and do not go poking around in it. People have died before." The Gryffindor's eyes were wide, and he was taken aback by the sharpness of Yugi's words, and mostly the words themselves. He stumbled back a few steps when he sensed a unfitting darkness surround the King of Games. "You're not talking to duelists anymore. Those days are long gone. This is a war, boy. Act like it. When people all around stagger away from something in fear, turn and run.
Do not confront it when you are unable to defend yourself. I'm not dangerous, not to you. But next time, that thing you confront might kill you without blinking. Aunt, Cole said and grabbed his friend's hand. Let's just go. We'll miss the train if we don't hurry. Aunt didn't look at Cole, but followed when the Ravenclaw dragged him after him. Instead, his eyes were still focused on Yugi. He was frowning and not a little taken aback. Yugi sighed. That probably sounded more threatening than it was supposed to. I'm sorry, you're just children. I should not have lost my composure. We understand that it's a sensitive subject, Cole said hastily and hurried off with Aunt following swiftly. This is the first time I've ever seen you become so angry, especially at children, Rio said calmly, having gathered himself. I understand your reaction, but you really shouldn't. I know, I'm learning, Yugi said. I had just forgotten how it is to be in a world there everyone knows and acknowledges Atem's presence. They'd be better off without it. True, but things are the way they are. What did Atem do anyway? He asked, and although Rio was genuinely interested, he was also trying to lead Yugi away from any regrets. Come have a look, Yugi said and gestured with his head towards the tomb. Now that he wasn't focused on the two boys anymore, he could see that they had had quite an audience. No one would have heard him, but they had most likely seen everything. He went with his hand through his hair, dejected. He did never do anything correctly. Rio trailed with his fingers over the mark on the tomb. Beautiful. But why? A gift, Yugi said, but also a warning. It's an old seal. They used it in Atem's time, a hieroglyph carved into entries of tombs. These seals were a warning. Tomb robbers who saw these seal knew that the tomb in question held ichors or traps. Sometimes a name was added to it. The name of the person who had sworn to protect the tomb. That rarely happened, though. Did you want a name? Rio wondered with a frown as he looked at the complicated hieroglyph. Yugi shook his head. No, that's not the point. It's the gesture. The seal isn't even telling the truth. And besides, no one would get it anyway. Rio smiled. I'm sure he'll appreciate it. Yes, I think so too. Let's hope no one sees this as grave violation, Yugi said with a small smirk. He dug his hands in his pockets and turned away from the marble stone, walking back up the aisle. Most ministry officials had disappeared, and all the students had gone with the train, something which disappointed Yugi. He would have liked to talk to Peter, Jean, and Tracy. Then he saw a person he still needed to catch leaving, and he set off a bit faster. He fastened his pace to a sort of running to make sure he caught her before she was able to leave. Her black robes were appropriate for a funeral, but her glasses and accessories were as colorful as ever, mostly green. Mrs. Skeeter! Miss Skeeter! He called out, stumbling over chairs as he tried to catch up with her. She stopped and looked at first rather shocked at his approach, but then her expression turned into a disgusting smile. Yugi had to remind himself that she did not recall their last encounter. When he saw that smile, it thoroughly pissed him off. There actually wasn't too much in this world which was able to make him feel the way the reporter's smile could. Yes? I have a question for you, Yugi said, slightly panting from the sprint. Dad, normally I'm the one asking questions, she said, her smile still in place. The green quill was hovering over her notebook, which in its turn was hovering in midair. Smogdley, Yugi said. Do you know him? Rita looked honestly surprised. Yes, of course I did. He died almost a year ago in a peculiar accident. Never wrote any scandalous articles. A pity, really. Yugi did, however, not bother to listen further. He knew what he wanted to know. Clearly, the secrets of the Spirit Division were important enough to kill for. Naturally, there was no telling if he had been murdered, but it was simply too close to the interview for him not to be. I see. Thank you. Not paying any attention to Rita's protests, Yugi walked away. Back in the aisle, he was met by Rio. What was that all about? The albino asked. Smugly. He found out about what was going on in the Spirit Division. He's dead now. I was afraid something like that might happen. She said it was an accident, but I just don't believe it to be a coincidence that he died so soon after I told him. Rio understood and put a hand on Yugi's shoulder. It's not her fault. Actually, in this case it was, Yugi muttered, and felt that Atem shared the guilt he felt over Smugly's death. I'm sorry, Rio just said, knowing that protesting might make things worse. The both of them slumped down on the golden chair and looked around. Most of the people had left, taken the train with the students, or simply because Yugi was there. The teachers of Hogwarts were, however, all still there, and Yugi saw Professor Flitwick stand with a bald man whose stomach threatened to tear his robes from mere size, and with Professor Bathsheba babbling at Dumbledore's tomb. It was obvious that they were talking about him, as the bald professor kept shooting him angry glances, while Professor Babbling was explaining something in low voice and exceeding gestures. "I wonder what they are talking about," Rio stated, taking the words out of Yugi's mouth. Well, the short one is Professor Flitwick," Yugi stated. "He teaches charms. I honestly have no idea who the angry man is, and the woman is Professor Babbling. She teaches ancient runes. I think she's explaining what the hieroglyph means. That's good." "Yugi?" a female voice said from his right. Madame Hooch was standing to Yugi's right, not looking resigned, perhaps, but doubtful. "Would you like to come with us into the castle? I imagine you'd want to know what has happened. Perhaps your friend, too." It had been a very long time since Yugi spoke with Madame Hooch. Actually, the last time had been when she had informed him that Professor Dumbledore had wanted to see him. That had been the same evening that a Tem had been taken. They had laughed and joked when they had last spoken. Thinking back about it now, Hogwarts really had a good influence on him. "Madame Hooch, are you afraid?" Yugi asked, without looking at her. He had his hands folded in his lap and was staring at the ground. Madame Hooch was silent for a while, thinking the question and the answer through. Yugi liked that. He liked that she did not simply say a hasty yes or no. Then after a while of silence, she spoke, her words slow and carefully chosen. "At first, yes. But thinking through it, no, I don't think so. Fundamentally, you're still the same, and I did not fear you. In fact, I liked you quite a bit. You were something of a change." Then Yugi looked up at her and showed an absolutely genuine smile. "Then I'd love to." "Aren't you going to say hello?" he asked her as they looked down on the field with the many golden chairs from the tower. "Aren't you?" she replied as her ghostly form was sitting on the balustrade. "No, you did not answer my question." "I can't. Not yet, anyway. Not with any of them, really," she answered and looked at the man with the white robes. "Why aren't you?" "The time is not right for neither of us. But when that time comes, I will be glad to greet my king once again and fight at his side." "Yeah," Rebecca repeated. "When the time is right. I just hope that when that time comes, it'll be a little easier." "Rebecca," Mahar whispered, "it is always hardest on the leaving."